And hello again, boys and girls. Welcome back to our channel. It's of course your host Marley Startled, and today to recap or cap off on Mechabellum, I thought I'd give a unit guide on pros and cons, best units to use in what sort of situations, as well as their sort of weaknesses and their sort of abilities and skills. And that should hopefully end my Mechabellum. I'll keep it going, perhaps play in my spare time or the casual sort of streams. But for now, let's begin. So the first unit we will start with is of course the Crawler. So the Crawler is one of the units you would normally start with as one of your specialist decks selections, and these are sort of your chaff. They're great at swarming, and they have the ability to quite easily overwhelm mid-range to high-level units as long as there's not a hard counter for them. Of course, they have no air capability, and once they are countered hard, and they'd be countered quite easily into the early game using things such as the Arc Light, which is a very good medium anti-swarm weapon, so they can spawn that early and cancel it out. What makes the Crawler quite good though is that early on it can be used to overwhelm an enemy before they build up a counter fort or invest in a counter, and you can get some quite easy points. At the same time, while they're still on the field, they'll occupy fire from enemy larger units for a couple of seconds at the very least, allowing your sort of middle range weapons and higher level weapons more time to do damage. So they're great at protecting your better units while the opponent's units try and deal with your crawlers first. They also make good ambush weapons, so if you plant them on the flanks of your enemy, they have a very good capability of getting an easy, quick kill on enemy towers that can then weaken the enemy for your main force. Of course, once they are countered, they will be countered quite hard, and so they shouldn't really be relied upon into mid to late game because they have no air capability, so immediately an air can counter this, and they're very cheap options to actually completely invalidate the Crawler. And if the opponent really invests, they can do some serious damage with just some flamethrower troops. The Crawler is a very versatile, quick rush damage early on unit, but should quickly be sort of filtered out as the game progresses. So unless you're very lucky with your swarms, they're not recommended. So the different abilities you have is called Mechanical Drill. That increases the unit's speed and reduces the attack interval, but it costs a whopping 200 credits. That will then of course not be spent on other units. Probably not the best to invest in because you don't want to be going too hard into your crawlers, simply because they can be easily and hard countered. Replicate on the other hand is 250 credits and is perhaps something you may want to look into, because what you can do is if you have enough crawlers on the field with Replicate, you can keep that swarm going, meaning that you're buying more time for your better units, and if they do survive and they do get an ambush and do overwhelm the enemy, they can do some serious damage by their replication. So this is a very situational ability, but ability that you perhaps should go down if you believe that you have a couple of rounds before the player enacts a hard counter. Subterranean Blitz I have looked at, although it is moderately good at nullifying damage. Again, a hard flamethrower counter will completely render that unusable, so Replicate is probably where you want to go. Acidic Blast, on the other hand, is pretty much valueless and is probably more likely to sabotage you than sabotage the enemy, so it's not something you should really invest in. Impact Drill, increase attack by around 25%. I haven't invested in it. Does look quite interesting, but again, I think this is really an early round unit and shouldn't be something you really focus on building up, simply because they can be hard countered by air and by flamethrower vehicles. In short, the Crawler is a great early game rush. It's a great way of getting an easy win on one of the rounds by doing a flanking attack, and it can bog down enemy units in regards to basically tanking hits. Their weaknesses, once they are countered, they will be hard countered and become more or less valueless, meaning that although it's a very good one-trick pony for swarming, it's unfortunately pretty much limited after that point, and can, if you go too hard into crawlers, will quickly sort of lose that balance of power. So I'd probably rate Crawler about a 5 or 6 out of 10, just in terms of its capability. The next step will be the Fang. So these are your chaff infantry units. These can also tank hits and are great against things like hackers, and because they can fire at ranged units, they're also fairly good at least doing some damage to, say, wasps and larger, more air units. These are your slower paced crawlers, and these guys can take quite a bit of a pounding and can fire at range. Their characters, of course, they're slow, meaning they can be heavily countered by artillery, and although they can fire at flying units. They are very quickly overwhelmed by tankier units because their damage just doesn't grow up. This is perhaps your alternative to the crawler, and can be quite useful when dealing with counter swarms, while also being quite useful at countering, being your sort of soft all-rounder. The Ignite capability I've never really used, simply because it's a 200 credits I could invest elsewhere. But the increased range is exceptionally good, especially if you want to deal with, say, longer range, further back units and tanks, so on and so forth, or flamers, which means that if you fire at longer range, you're less likely to take this damage. It's quite a useful skill, and something I would recommend getting into if you need that extra range increase. Mechanical range, I would not really bother investing in, because again, it's 300 credits. You could invest in upgrading or putting in something else, another unit perhaps, to increase your roster and sort of give your match a bit more versatility. So mechanical range is not something I would spend many points on. However, the portable shield is perhaps something, if you have the points, to invest in early on, because this again allows your fangs to become more tankier. Armor piercing bullets I've not invested in, but it's still something I could potentially look into. In short, a Fang is your slower paced, more general weapon to complement the rest of your force, and although it won't survive against heavy saturation, it will still buy time for your better units to take some hits. Things that can really hard counter these are, of course, airstrikes and rockets, so bear in mind that your Fangs will be heavily countered by ranged units and fast units. And will be swarmed eventually by crawlers. So a great supporting unit as chaff, but a unit that's not going to individually win a significant battle and is not going to really turn the tables. Great for an early investment, great just to pad numbers, but something I wouldn't really mass or focus on completely. So for this, I'd probably give this about 6 out of 10, because it's slightly better than the crawler in terms of its hard counters. Meaning that it still can get into the fight early on, but still it's going to be heavily overrun once the late game starts. Arclight is something I never really invest in, but the Arclight is very good as an early game counter swarmer. If you go crawlers early on and you see your opponent has got Arclights, you are probably going to lose the first couple of rounds if you've gone into crawler spam. These guys can tank quite a few hits, and are pretty much great at knocking out swarm troops like the Fang and the Crawler. Equally, because they're quite cheap units to invest in as well, they make an anti-swarm very easy to achieve. And by massing them, you've got quite heavy tank units, or tankier units, to get rid of, say, of marksman and draw fire. A very good weapon that I never really bothered to invest in, because although it's quite tanky, it's still very slow and it has quite a slow rate of fire. But if you are dealing with a swarming force, they're like a crawler Fang spam, then your Arclights are great because they can hold a line, knock out those swarmers, but they are very limited by their speed and, of course, by the fact that their damage is pretty meh against mid-level units like tanks. Their range and harm is quite good, but something again I probably wouldn't really invest in. My Arclight is normally just my chaff tank early on in the round, and it can do the job without needing the range increase. And because its damage is pretty then I'd rather put that range increase into another unit. The electromagnetic shot is something I've never really bothered looking at because it's 200 credits, and again I'd rather spend that on a chunkier, more powerful unit than the humble Arclight. Same with the arc shot, but perhaps I would go into arm enhancement because it's only 150 and makes it even more tankier, meaning that it can stay in the fight for longer and draw fire. The Arclight is your great counter, and although I don't use it a lot early game, it's a solid 7 out of 10. It's pretty much limited by its anti-air capabilities, it's limited by its speed, it can be countered by mid-range units quite easily, your tanks, and to a lesser extent your mid-level sort of large robots, but it is a fairly good early game round, and great if you just want to, if you're seeing your opponent start mass stacking swarms, then you can start mass stacking Arclights for sort of cheap counter to it. But so a solid 7 out of 10. I haven't really invested in the anti-aircraft ammunition, so I wouldn't really bother on that either. The marksman, the rather painful marksman, is a glass cannon, but I've seen many games where a swarming of marksmen can really win the early rounds for you. These bad boys fire at long range, they do quite a hefty bit of damage, they can do anti-air, and they really do a lot of damage. So they're going to really knock out your mid-level tanks, they're going to knock out your mid-level Mustangs, they're going to knock out even your warships. So if you're dealing with a mothership, get enough marksmen in the field and they will knock that bad boy out. They are very powerful early on, but they are countered by swarm units and artillery. One of the strongest counters I found is when trying to snipe motherships with a marksman, that the use of the wasp ability does render the marksman harder to use because they will target the wasps rather than the mothership. In terms of its versatility, however, it's such a powerful weapon with its double shot and that range enhancement. So even though it's a glass cannon and can get ambushed in the earlier rounds with the use of flank crawlers and flank fangs and so on and so forth, it's a versatile unit that can last you to the late game. Its big limitations are things like the sledgehammer and, of course, the larger automatic robots, but great for if you want to knock out your flying troops, such as the mothership. So the runs I would generally go for is the double shot and the range enhancement, because if you get enough of these guys in the field early on, unless you're dealing with a real horrid swarm, which you can quite easily counter with flamers, they will just dominate, and you can't really stop them until you've got some longer sort of troops, longer range weapons, or some really sort of shields. So a very powerful unit. I'd give this a solid 9 out of 10 because this can carry you through from the early game to the mid game and still be very useful to the late game, whereas say the crawler and the fang and the arc light slowly does begin to drop off as more credits are going into the field and larger, stronger units are going in. Definitely a very good unit. The Mustang, I see it every now and then, normally good against swarmers and wasp spam. The Mustang falls down, it's an anti-aircraft weapon. The Mustang falls down against sort of tanks its level and tankier units, but it's great against rocket artillery spam. Get enough of those in the field and your Hellfire spam will just be rendered useless, and great against wasps, as well as your chaff units such as fangs and crawlers. Their weakness is that they don't do very much damage against motherships, meaning that they are rendered somewhat useless against the tankier troops or the tankier, heavier robots, including the Rhino and as mid-level tanks. So it's great if you're starting to see your opponent going into air spam or rocket spam, and has some versatility as cleaning up mobs and chaff. But when you start seeing the more tankier tanks, your Rhinos, your sledgehammers, you can start to see these drop off. So great as an early range counter, but not something you should be heavily investing into. So you see the missile interceptor skill is great for anti-artillery. The range enhancement is also great to have. And the high explosive, not something I would generally invest in, or the aerial specialization, simply because I want it all round. You could perhaps go with aerial specialization as a potential if you want to go for that sort of counter to heavy air spam, but I would generally advise more for the missile interception against artillery and the range enhancement if you need to. I would give this a solid 7 again, simply because it's great at what it does, which is anti-air, but is easily countered against just your standard tanks and your standard mid-level robots. So 7 out of 10, a great answer to wasps and a great answer to artillery and chaff. Not such a great answer against the tankier troops you'll start seeing towards the mid-game. This is something you more likely push out towards your early rounds, and then as a versatile counter to the growing threat of enemy air. Now, the sledgehammer is often overlooked, but a very, very potent weapon. So this is a heavy tank, and it comes in quite a large squad. And this bad boy is quite useful because it's pretty good against chaff. It's pretty good against mid-range tanks. It's pretty good if massed up enough against and upgraded enough even against marksmen, and it's pretty good at dealing with late game units as well, just as a force multiplier. What makes this weapon so powerful is the field maintenance, which increases HP and its repair, meaning that it will stay in the fight for much, much longer, meaning that these tanks are actually tanky tanks. And their damage sharing, although something I don't really invest in, is something you can potentially go down. I would go with normally the field maintenance on this, or perhaps the range enhancement, depending on how far I want to go into. A big weakness of these bad boys is simply the fact that they have no air capability, meaning that they're more or less extremely vulnerable to air spam, and because they're fairly slow, they can also take a significant damage against longer range marksmen and artillery spam as well. These are your great frontline troops. They're versatile, they'll stay to the late game, and when upgraded can continue to sort of provide added value to your unit, whereas things like crawlers and fangs start to fall off. But these guys you can pretty much hold through as your sort of mid-level, mid-range force. Recommended for early game if you can pick that option as a potential initial starting unit, and also recommended for your mid-game as well, where you can start sort of building that front line and keep on drawing fire so your larger mechs can get into the fight. A very, very versatile, very strong, somewhat underrated tank, and something I would highly recommend getting and investing in if you have that option at the start of the game. Weakness, no air capability, so they'll get swarmed by air, and slow, so if there's artillery, they'll get swarmed. So if you want, you can perhaps go with a Mustang sledgehammer build, and sort of that will get you through quite the early mid game, or failing that, you should start sort of pushing forward with longer range, heavier units after the sledgehammer. Definitely an 8 out of 10. There are counters to it. If enough spam will overwhelm it, and its air will render it pretty much useless. So I'd actually probably bring it down to a 7. That's about a 7 out of 10. Great for early game, but heavily countered by air. The Stormcaller, well, the Trollcaller back in the early access days, used to be the go-to for most units, most players, because the Stormcaller is basically an artillery unit that has great range, can knock out chaff easily, and can knock out marksmen, especially early level marksmen, before they get the range upgrades. These guys, if you swarm enough of them, can do serious damage and can just really support against most fights. Their only caveat is that they are quite slow, and again, they have no air capability. At the same time, you can also start seeing more anti-missile units, such as the Mustang, and later units as well, that will render your Stormcallers more or less useless. And equally, adding the use of shields can pretty much render your Stormcallers mute. So great early game to spam, but you've got to have an answer to the mid to late game, because they'll get to a stage where the enemy will start pulling out air, or they'll start pulling out the counters that will render those hellfire pretty much useless. So it's something that will get you the early wins, but if the opponent is somewhat good, then they will just counter you, and then you'll struggle. The Incendiary Bomb is something I would never really use, because again, AoE is not very good in this game because you have a risk of wounding your own units. Range enhancement is definitely something I would invest in, especially if you want to start dealing with marksman spam or chaff spam, and because then you can get into, even though you're quite slow, you can compensate with your range enhancement. So while your other units push forward, you can sit at the back firing those rockets and be fine. Launch overload is something I've never really looked at, because it's the range impact, which I just dislike. Your Stormcallers, you should have units that are constantly in the fight for as long as you can. High explosive ammo, not really cared about splash damage, because again, you want to do your heavy hitters. And these guys I haven't invested in, so I can't really give you an opinion on those, sadly. In short, really heavily countered by air. They are somewhat vulnerable to flanking attacks, and they can be countered by anti-missile attacks. But early on, they can really be the force multiplier that counters most armies, and is something you can actually invest in quite early on. Maybe just two units of these, and they'll stay useful for the rest of the game. But building more than 2, then you're just asking to get hard countered, and it's not worth the cost. The other caveat is that the missiles actually do fall down a lot against moving tanker units like fortresses and rhinos, so something you perhaps should avoid doing once you're investing in further, once you start seeing those bad boys come out. I would go with a solid 8 out of 10 again. A great 2 of these at the start of the game, no more, no less, and that's enough for you to game. And that's always a useful weapon to have. The steel ball is something I very rarely invest in. And the reason I very rarely invest in the steel ball is because of its time to kill. So the idea of the steel ball is that it rolls up against an enemy, fires its lasers, the lasers heat up and start doing more and more damage over time. The thing is, that's a slow time to kill, and by the late game, with enough chaff, enough heavy tanks, you're going to get overwhelming destroyed before you can do any damage. So early game, it's something I try and avoid investing in, because I know by the mid to late game they're pretty useless. Now, it does have the conversion capability, but again, against chaff, there's even the slightest fang or slightest crawler, because it has to target one unit at a time, it becomes more or less useless. So it's heavily countered by chaff, meaning that these steel balls can easily be overrun. At the same time, the damage showing is something I wouldn't bother investing in, nor the range. Really, when I see these guys, I might invest in 2, or to spawn the initial starting 2, but I won't go further into these, because although they're good against heavy units, the opponent can just dump some chaff in front of it, and that's the end of that steel ball. It becomes more or less useless. All in all, pretty mid-range weapon. I'd give it a 5 out of 10. If you've got it and you have to use it, that's fine. It'll be okay against mid-range units, but it will struggle against rhinoceroses and artillery and chaff. Basically, pretty much struggle against everything. Struggle against air. It just struggles against too many things to be useful. So it's not something I would generally go with. So a solid 5 out of 10. The tarantula is something I've never really touched, if I'm honest with you. So I can't really give an opinion on a tarantula. I generally don't use it. It's normally something that I will perhaps spawn as a card, but I don't really see what it can be used for. So it says a heavy unit equipped with 2 rapid fire cannons that can fight various enemies at medium range. The problem with having those jack of all trades is that there's plenty of other units that can do that without the cost investment, and I just don't think it has much value because I've never really seen it on the field. I can't really give an honest opinion about this, but I just don't think it's worth doing. If it's going to go anti-air, why not build air? If you're going to go for anti-units, why not build rhinoceri or sledgehammers or saber-tooths? Or, you know, it seems like a tank that tries to do everything and it really accomplishes nothing. So I can't really give an opinion, but I've never really seen it used frequently in games. Now the Rhino, this bad boy can be an absolute nightmare. So the Rhino is a melee tank, or melee robe, and these bad boys, once they upgrade enough, can be absolute nightmares. They can decimate chaff, they can run through enemy lines, you can spawn them on the flanks and just watch them destroy enemy towers, and you spawn enough of them and they can just wipe the floor with the enemy. Because they're tanky, they do a lot of damage against chaff, and some of their bonuses is really powerful. Like the Whirlwind will just annihilate all chaff. You've got 2 squads of crawlers, Whirlwind, they're both dead. The photon coating makes it even more tankier, and if you've got, say, bonuses, if you've taken a card that increases an arm of a unit or regen for a unit, this just makes it even worse. You can heal, and it can also self-destruct. So if you want to, you can just go heavy into rhinos and pretty much wipe the floor with most melee units. The only thing that will knock this out is long-range units, heavy focused fire on it, and air. It has no sort of counter to air. So a Rhino, although good at a frontline tank weapon that can just do heavy damage and push through units and just render your an opponent's swarm or render an opponent's mid-level units on the front useless, these are great. But for your snipers or for your melting points, they will quite easily deal with your Rhino. The right counter for Rhino is I might just dump a couple of wasps on top of it and my wasp will fire upon it and kill it, or I'll dump a mothership on it, and that's all she wrote really. Hellfires do some okay damage in numbers, but just mass firepower will knock these out as long as you have the range to keep them out of melee. And air just knocks these guys out completely. But you can put one of these down and normally get a guaranteed win on that round, because most players won't be unprepared to deal with a Rhino because they're still on that mid-level mindset, or that mid-unit mindset. Then they'll perhaps counter with air, and then you know what they're going to do next. A Rhino is actually a very cheeky unit to have, and when upgraded and given special abilities, it can really make it can just make the round so much easier. Although sometimes it's something I don't invest in quite a lot, but whenever I see a free Rhino, I'll normally dump one down. And I do like the Rhino because it just has that oomph to it. Definitely a solid 8.5 out of 10 because it's great against air. Oh no, it's not. What am I talking about? It's just great at smashing up lines. You spawn and spam enough of these bad boys, they're going to wipe the front line of troops. Get rid of all the chaff, tank a load of hits. The only things that are going to stop them is ranged, air, and like melting points, or perhaps hackers, if they can get the range on them. But yeah, these guys are definitely lethal weapons. The hacker, now the hacker is a weird one. So the hacker's ability, of course, to hack, to turn enemy units to your side. But it takes quite a lot of time to hack a full health unit. So normally you'll be hacking up to, say, a mid-level, mid-health unit. And they're very useful against, say, bots, against heavier, stronger bots, fortresses, flamethrowers, rhinos. Because if you get enough damage on a rhino, it will change to your side. Also, their shield capability allows for that sort of frontline support. So if you put them on the front line, perhaps just behind some chaff, then you can protect your chaff with that shield. The only thing is that they have to be used en masse to be truly effective, because it just takes so long for one hacker to take over a single bot. And if you have one hacker to take over a single bot, by the time you've done that, the bot's probably already dead. So you have to use multiple of them, and then what happens is they get countered by chaff, because it's very difficult for them to direct who they're hacking. So you throw out a couple of wasps, throw out some fangs, throw out some crawlers, and the hacker becomes really useless if your friendly troops can't kill them quickly enough. So the hacker's greatest weakness is chaff, but its strongest weakness against heavy, strong units, and it has that support capability of that shield. Now it has got the multi-control ability, but I don't really see the point using multi-control on chaff, simply because I'd rather have my hacker targeting one tank or one heavy robot like a fortress, as opposed to dealing with multiple chaff. It just doesn't seem worth it. The barrier is definitely something I would invest in, because you can put these on the front line, put 2 or 3 next to each other. They're going to protect your units. Your units are going to stay in the battle longer, and it'll buy your hacker some time to do some hacking. Very good along with the range increase. So these 2 I would normally go with. And I do like this as well. If you can get this, it's something, but it's a lot to invest. You're talking 900 credits. That's one large robot. That's a war factory. That's a couple of rhinos. It's a lot to invest. I mean, you can do a hacker rush and the spam hackers, but there is it can be countered, and it's perhaps not something. And once it is heavily countered, you will probably die in the next couple of rounds before you have a time to build enough hackers to deal with it. Still, a very versatile unit, great support role. I would generally use it for the mid-level, early mid, probably mid-game. But then once you do commit to the hackers, you need lots of hackers, and then you need to be prepared for the swarm counters. So it's very situational. I'd probably give it a 7 out of 10, maybe an 8 out of 10, simply because it can be countered by chaff. And once they are knocked out, once they aren't doing that synergy of hacking stronger units in time, they quickly become useless, and often you'll die in the next couple of rounds, because the joy of the hacker is the fact it can hack a strong enemy unit, and then that takes a strong enemy unit out of the battle. But if your unit's not hacking quick enough, they die too quickly, then that fortress stays alive, and then the fortress behind it adds to your hit points, and the fortress behind that adds again to your hit points, and it can really easily knock you out quickly. So I'd go about 7 out of 10. My babies, I used to love the wasps because they had the joy of air. Now, as you probably know already, a lot of the early mid-level units don't have anti-air capability, so you can spam a couple of those and that will get you some quick wins. And once you start upgrading them and they get higher levels with the energy shield, the range enhancement, and even the ground specialization, they become extremely potent when used en masse. The only thing is that they can be heavily countered by Mustangs, but if you level them up enough, then they can perhaps outlast said Mustangs, especially with upgrades. Their biggest weakness, however, is against, say, motherships, against anti-aircraft such as Mustangs, and even just over time, just the fangs and just a rocket strike can knock these bad boys out. But great early game for an I-win round, and then you do force your opponent to have to invest. The only thing is that to really get the most out of your wasp, you have to use them as a swarm. So you have to have multiple units on a single flank, and that opens them up to sort of missiles, and they are extremely weak against your motherships and your stronger air force. So I used to really like these guys, use them on mass early round. These guys will win you the first couple of rounds, but they will drop off unless you really commit. And the thing about this game is that if you really commit to one strategy, if the player, your opponent does put out a hard counter, you can quickly lose the game. So the wasp is something I would I like the versatility of, I like its air capability, but now I've sort of fallen out of love with it, so now I'll give it about 6 out of 10. It's because of the cost of investment as opposed to the reward, and now it seems to be very easily hard countered these days. Still, very good if you can get enough of them en masse. Maybe if you use a tower ability to mass deploy even more of them, you can swarm early on. The Phoenix, something I very rarely use. Normally I've tried to use it as a counter to motherships because of their range and their extra damage. These bad boys, again, have the air capability to them, but there's only 2 units and they are quite easy to kill against, say, marksmen and so on and so forth. My go-to for these guys is see a couple of motherships, spam a couple of these. They're cheaper alternatives. There's 2 units, so it takes longer for them to die, and they do quite a hefty bit of damage. But it's not something I would generally sort of invest in usually. I can't really say much about these guys. I might go for the range enhancement, maybe go for the energy shield, but not something normally it's something I use in response to something rather than to take the initiative. I normally wouldn't put these bad boys down as the attacking to lead, but to react to an opponent. So these are great soft counters to, say, mothership spam and to an extent other air units. So I'd give these I'd give them about 7 as well, 7 out of 10. I have not really used a Wraith. I feel they're pretty useless. They're a bit tanky, but they're too short range, and of course if you dump them along, they can be countered by other air units like the Phoenix, and they're so short range that anti-air will knock these guys out. I mean, I generally don't use them. I think there's other units out there which are better, which are more offensive capability, like the mothership. So I'm not even going to really discuss this unit. Haven't really used it. Don't see the reason to use it. Seems quite expensive to buy. Just doesn't seem worth the risk. Swarm, again, haven't really used. Why? Because by the stage you're using swarms, you should already have enough arc lights on the ground or your own counter. Swarm to swarm their swarm. So I just don't see the point in using them. I just don't see the point of using these. Double shot, why use it when I use a marksman range? Well, if I want to do counter swarm, I use a rocket battery. Siege mode, why do I care about this? Acid attack, nah, it just does seem like a useless tank. I'd give us about 3. These bad boys are your heavy counters to swarms. These guys, knock one of these guys out of a range enhancement, and they will stick that in the middle of the front line, and they will just knock out all the fangs. They will knock out all the crawlers and render them pretty much useless. If you see a swarm going to attack you, dump one of these down, you'll win that round. If you really need to, dump 2 down. What they fall down with is they are awful against heavier bots. They will get knocked out by rhinos, they'll get knocked out by saber-tooth teeth or saber-tooths, and they are no air capability, but very good for I win that round. You're swarm spamming, let me put this down, I win. And because they will be persistently useful in the later rounds because they will always be countering that swarm. So one of these is your great one use fire forget weapon. Put 2 of these down, don't invest in them anymore. Maybe do upgrades if you need to, maybe get the range enhancement, but that will be your anti-swarm dealt with. That'll be your swarm dealt with. Now you can build other units. A great check, great counter to a swarm build. Again, no air. They will get knocked out by rhinos who will just run up in front of them and smack them, and get knocked out by longer range units and air. So once you put these down, expect to start seeing rhinos, expect to see heavier tanks, expect to see longer range weapons, expect to see air, and start reacting accordingly. So if I banged a rhino down, I'd probably start banging down my own heavy mechs or start investing in air capability. I would go with a 9 out of 10, simply because even though it's only a one-trick pony, it's a one-trick pony that does its job extremely well, and it will just make your front line so much easier if it survives long enough. It will just wipe out all the chaff. And one of the best counters I found for it is perhaps a hacker or a rhino, but these guys will just win you the first round against a swarm spam. I haven't used the melting point too often because, again, it's a time to kill, but they're long range. If they do aim at the right target and you've got enough of them and your front line is still intact, they will knock out the heavier units. They will knock out the motherships. They will knock out the fortresses. They will knock out the rhinos. These guys are really just limited by These guys are your force multiplier. They're not going to win the battle for you, but if you get them in the right place and the right placement, then you can knock out the big units that will turn the tide. However, if enough of your swarm survives, then these guys are more or less useless. At the same time, snipers and that can do okay if used on numbers, and artillery barrages can also do a pretty strong counter to them. Weakness of these are swarms. Weakness of these are longer range units, artillery barrages, and just your mid-range units. So these are your counter to your heavy robots. But why build these? I just build my own heavy robots. I just don't see the point in doing so, unless I see a lot of motherships banned, and maybe I'll spam these as counter. But I just don't really see the versatility in using that, as long as I use that money to invest in more chaff or upgrade it. Still, they're still pretty useful. I've seen them used now to knock out a couple of my main attacks if they put behind the rear line and given that range increase. But again, they're either going to turn the tide or they're just going to be useless. And the thing with this game is that if they are useless, you're going to lose a ton of HP because they're not going to win that key battle. How would I put it like this way? How do I put it? If you've got a pretty even force, you might lose 200 HP if you lose that battle. If you use a melting point, you can change and knock out the enemy's heavy units and then turn it very strongly in your favor and do maybe 1000 HP. But if these melting points fail, then you're going to take a big fuck off hit as well. So it's very much a knife fight with these guys. The fortress is something I have looked at a while. I don't generally use it because, again, it's like a tanky all-rounder, but it is very good at holding the line and doing heavy damage. If you don't really know which way the opponent's going to go, then you've got the anti-air barrage, you've got the range enhancement, but these are vulnerable to melting points. These are vulnerable to air spam, because even though they've got the anti-air barrage, they don't do very limited damage to motherships, wasps, and the like. Great against pretty much chaff, mid-range and mid-level tanks, but these guys are limited in regards to anti-large, like the melting point or the hacker. In all, a pretty good all-round unit. I'd give it about 7 and 8. Because I like doing extremes in my playstyle, I either go extreme at the best of the air, and then the best of the chaff, and then the best of the tanks. I generally will try and avoid these middle of the road units, but if you do need something that's to hold a line or just to tank hits, then maybe go for the fortress. So I'd give it about 7. I've only used the Sandworm a couple of times. I found it a bit useless. So its sort of best ability is that burrow maintenance, able to repair its health while it's burrowed. The thing is, once it gets into combat, it has to come out, and again, it does nothing against air. If you use it on the front line, there's still too many units on the field and they will obliterate your Sandworm. Use it in the back line, by the time it's useful, either the battle's been won or you're still dealing with an enemy swarm and you're going to get countered. I've seen it used somewhat a few times on flank attacks against sort of air to knock out towers, but I just feel like it's a bit of a wasted expenditure when I could spend that 400 on a fortress or a Vulcan. And I got if I one Sabertooth on this will just hold it in place for the next 30 seconds, or it will do okay against chaff, but it can be easily held in place by mid-level tankier tank like sledgehammers and fortresses and Sabertooth. So it's again very situational and doesn't seem very useful. Not motherships, overlords. Apologies, overlords. I meant overlords. So the Overlord is a great early I win button. So what do I mean by this? Often you're seeing the mid-level, mid-game, early mid-game, you're seeing players start to develop their front line. You start spotting that they haven't got any anti-air capability. So what do? You dump a couple of Overlords in. You dump 2 or 3 Overlords, or 2 Overlords if you can afford it, and you just win that round. And then that's 800 HP straight off to enemies' points, because they simply cannot target you because they haven't got the anti-air capability. Over time, once you start going with the mothership capability and start producing those 4 wasps, they start countering sniper spam. Even though they're quite vulnerable to sniper spam early on, they become very vulnerable once they become very much more powerful after the wasps start coming out. And that means they're very potent early on. I've seen players spam 4 of them with the direction ability and this act as a battering ram to knock out units and become unstoppable, especially when they're using their wasps. The only real weakness is the fact that they can be sniped out the air by snipers, and melting points also knock them out, and phoenixes are a pretty cost-effective way of dealing with them as well. Mustangs are more or less useless against motherships, but they are still a very useful I-win tool. If you're starting to see the enemy start to not really prepare for their air, an air sort of mid-range, mid-level air weapon utility, the motherships, the overlords will just swarm and annihilate. Remember, you only need 2 of these, so that's 800 HP. 2 of these for 2 rounds, so you use 2 in the first round, that's 800 HP off the enemy team. Putting down another 2 in close proximity, now you've got 1,600 HP off the enemy unit. Put down another 2, and well, I probably won't put another 2 down, but once you've got 4, you can start putting down other things. I really highly value this because of its the I-win ability on 1 round if you start seeing the situation develop into mostly ground warfare. So I would give this a solid 9 because it has that I-win button. The great thing about some units is that if you use it early and use it first, it's just an I-win. You can't do anything about it. And I've seen many games my troops just stagger on underneath the overlord to be knocked out slowly because I have no anti-air capability. The overlord is a very potent weapon, and I'd definitely recommend it as the coin flip or the about face for your current front line. The War Factory, I've tried using it and it's pretty bad for me. What I don't like about it is 800 XP, so that's 2 overlords you could have spent it on. And although it's got Phoenix production, Steel Ball production, you're talking about 800, 900, 1000, 1100, 1200, 1300. So that almost the cost of 4, 8. At the cost of 3 overlords, you have a War Factory, which can produce Phoenixes and Steel Balls. Often, by the time you get to the factory, the game's already won. It's supposed to be a tanky tank. It's supposed to be that constant production, that range increase, but that doesn't seem useful because if you try and save up for it to the early game, you've taken too much damage to come back from it. If you try and use it late game, well, by that stage, the map's already become this high specialized knife fight. It just doesn't seem like a very useful weapon at the moment. Perhaps in future it might be. Maybe if it produced more units quicker, like 1 Phoenix every 13 seconds, pretty useless. You'd either have to put this at the back of your front line to spawn enough, or just get lucky. I mean, it just doesn't seem like a very useful weapon at the moment for the War Factory, so I'd give this about a 3 out of 10, because by the time you use it, you've either already won or you've already lost, and it's such a big investment that even if it's the last vehicle standing, it just won't beat the enemy team. It's just not worth the investment. These guys, why would you use these? These cost 200 when you can just get get the Vulcan. Get one of these bad boys. I win. I just bang that in the middle of the front line. I win. It has more versatility. Why would I use a Fire Badger? I give this a 1 out of 10. Pretty much useless. Still, it's a rare unit. Any other rare units? No, it's a rare unit, but why would you use that? It just doesn't seem like it's got any use to it. The Sabertooth, on the other hand, really good. The Sabertooth is like a sledgehammer on steroids. It will 1v1 a sandworm and keep it in place for quite a long time, coupled with range enhancement and field maintenance, even if you want, and go for double shot if you really want to. And it will be your holder of the front line. It basically isn't going to go anywhere anytime soon. It can tank sniper shots, it can tank artillery barrages, it can tank heavier units, it can hold units in place while your other units do the damage and knock it out. The only weakness is air. That's all it is. Air that limits the sledgehammer. air, and the cost of a saber-tooth axe costs 200. Same cost of a sledgehammer. Wow. You just bang those bad boys out. I mean, maybe if enough of the swarm survived in the early game, it could do damage, but these bad boys are very useful weapons. I'd give it about an 8 again. No air, so if you do see air, these become pretty useless, but still, a very, very potent weapon. Why would I use this when I've got the sledgehammer? There you go, no interest. Basically a crappy Mustang. Why use this when I use a saber-tooth? Yeah, not interested. Support vehicle, I've seen it used occasionally. I don't really use it because you've got to invest in it, invest in these sort of special abilities to make it more useful. I wouldn't really generally use it. It's why use this when I can do a damage dealing weapon. It just seems like I take what for that 300 cost. I take that's a couple of units I could have deployed instead. Not really something I would bother investing in. So altogether, there we go.